When people discuss the hardest games of all time, there's always going to be mention of one of the titles from the Ninja Gaiden series. Whether it's NES or Xbox, these games are hard as hell, and the franchise has been kicking ass and taking names for almost 30 years now. The first time I ever heard of the series was from Angry Video Game Nerd and multiple hardest games list. So when I decided years ago that it was my mission to take down the hardest games, I knew I would have my hands full with this trilogy. I could go on and on about all of the frustration and heartache these games have caused, but at the end of the day, you have to admit the trilogy is worthy of lots of love, despite it leading to so many broken controllers. Each game has its own unique qualities such as their power-ups, enemies, stage design, and overall physics, so let's jump right into the saga to find out how good each game is and what makes them so damn hard. The first game starts out like the rest do, with a nice level at moderate difficulty for you to get a feel for the game, but don't worry, it doesn't take long for things to get hard. Ryu controls well and is overall quite responsive. The sword slash is fast and has decent range, plus you pick up sub-weapons along with magic, which serves as your ammo for your second attack, that you perform by holding up while pressing the attack button, just like in the Castlevania games. It's got a fast pace, which is great and makes you feel like a real ninja. You move with speed, and there's good enemy variety. Your sword kills with one hack, and the music gets you pumped. Plus, the way you cling to walls and jump back and forth is really cool, but this is where the control takes the most getting used to. It's nothing too crazy, but unless there's a ladder, you can't simply climb the walls in this game. You have to master a fragile art in order to climb. You press away and jump, then quickly press back toward the wall in order to scale. You also have to use this technique a couple times to move down a wall, which is even trickier. You end every level with a boss fight, and in general, the bosses in the series range from the easiest thing you've ever done to ball-throbbing frustration. And speaking of frustration, the second level is where most people will start to experience that and understand what the game is all about. When you get hit by an enemy, it knocks Ryu backward, and a lot of the time, that's what will end your life. The first level didn't make you worry about pits, but from the second level on, the game is full of them. A lot of the difficulty is just not being able to react to what you can't see coming. A fair amount of sections just require some trial and error, along with cat-like reflexes. If you don't know what's coming, you will unfortunately fall into one of the game's many traps. If you can't adapt and learn, you will get punished for it. Ninja Gaiden also has respawning enemies, so if you don't keep moving, you'll eventually be done for. Enemies typically do 1 or 2 pegs of health, while a couple such as birds, spin-kicking ninjas, or the silver surfer-looking guy can take away 3. Ninja Gaiden is great for beating bad habits out of gamers, that's for sure, such as careless jumping, which gets you knocked off stage and killed, or not moving forward quickly enough, which results in you getting gangbanged by a dozen enemies at once. A very useful technique I realized was to attack while jumping forward, which prevents respawning and gets you out of danger. If I were to give one bit of advice to anybody trying to beat this game, it's fuck everything else behind you and just keep running. But you can't be too fast, of course, if you don't know what's coming up. There are plenty of jumps where a bat, bird, soldier, cat, ninja, or projectile will knock you to your doom. Ninja Gaiden definitely has a brutal learning curve, but once you do get a hang of the levels, it's a very rewarding and fun game to bulldoze through. Once in a while, the only way to make it through a room is to rush through it. The perfect thing about the game is that you have unlimited continues and the checkpoints are reasonable. That is, of course, until the very end of the game, where if you die on any of the final 3 bosses, you must restart World 6. I was sent back 7 times the first time I beat this game, and it took hours. This is a super cruel and annoying thing for the developers to do, and thankfully they did learn from it and didn't do this again in the other 2 games. The first boss is fine once you know what you're doing, but the second form is super difficult and almost impossible to beat unless you stick to the right wall and fight from over there. This is the consistent way for its projectiles to leave the screen, otherwise they come back and are ridiculously hard to dodge. The boss never stops moving back and forth, so it's hard to get your shots in. As if it wasn't difficult enough, when you beat the first form, the game takes your sub-weapon away before the second fight. The third fight is pretty hard, but it's manageable. It does do a lot of damage to you with its projectiles, but at least you feel more in control of the fight. Overall, this is the Ninja Gaiden I've played the most. I enjoy the fast pace and flow of the levels. I've managed to beat it in 20 minutes flat a few times, which you can do if you just die once or twice. Ninja Gaiden 2 is a worthy sequel, and you can tell it tried hard to improve some of the flaws, plus bring new things to the table. First thing to mention is the control. It's almost the same, but feels a little different since you can actually climb, and your attack feels a bit slower. It's hard to describe. They have some new enemies, including a more common one that requires you to duck. They have a few new power-ups. I'd say the standout and my favorite is the one that gives you red shadow ninjas that follow what you do. You can use it strategically, and it's fun and clever. Some of the levels have stage elements such as the wind that changes direction, ice, which I'm sure you can guess what that does, plus lightning that flashes on and off, making it harder for you to see your way. This game is definitely hard, even brags about it on the box, but is overall more forgiving than the prequel. One thing that didn't change for the better is your knockback. It's even more abrupt and exaggerated in this game, which is of course frustrating, but there are less deliberate attempts at this game being cheap with a trial and error trap. There were a couple things that changed that weren't needed, like for one, it feels like Ryu's slash is just a fraction slower, and I also noticed that it seems to have a smaller and slower hitbox. There were plenty of times where I'd see my sword go right through an enemy, but I would pay the price. I mean, it really is infuriating to watch your failed attack result in you falling to your death. Like the previous game, it's fun to rush forward and take enemies out with your sword, but to me, it just didn't seem to flow as well. There are parts where it felt like they load the screen with enemies, and it doesn't feel as well thought out. The knockback is annoying, so you're bouncing back and forth, but it's an easier game. Enemies don't do as much damage. You can get away with being a bit sloppier in this game and still make it through its levels. The bosses range from fairly easy to pretty annoying. Some of the backgrounds in this game make it kinda hard to look at. I find myself squinting a lot when I play some of the levels in Ninja Gaiden 2. Just like the last game, you have unlimited continues, and they are reasonable with the checkpoints. The last level is definitely hard and required much more effort to beat than the rest. They definitely pulled the tricks back out in this level with many more pits and enemies. Plus, it's a pretty long level with less forgiving checkpoints that make it harder to play through. There are 3 final bosses again. The first form is like a toned down version of the prequel's second form. It's definitely still difficult, but sticking to one wall is helpful once again. If you die on the boss, it sends you back to the beginning of this brutal level. It's way better than starting the world over, but this is still very cruel. The second form is pretty annoying because there are so many damn drops that are rapid and never stop, along with the boss's projectile every few seconds. I think this is the hardest of the 3 bosses because you can die fast and the stupid drops are just so rapid. You really need to focus on your movement to stay out of harm's way while lunging in for your attack. The third form is pretty intimidating, but really it's just a toned down version of the third form from the first game. You just need to get the face out of the way again so you can attack the heart while looking out for its hands and projectiles. It's a solid sequel with new and cool ideas, plus it tried to balance the difficulty a bit more. If you're looking to get into the series, I'd recommend starting with the second one. It is the most accessible, but do be warned, it is pretty hard. The third entry is where things get more different, and I do believe that this is the most difficult game in the trilogy. It's the black sheep of the trilogy and was also never released in Europe. A lot of people prefer the first 2 games in the series to this one. Most of the criticisms have to do with some changes and the difficulty, and some are about its plot, but honestly when it comes to platformers, that should never be the obsession. I mean, Mario uses the same plot for every game and nobody really cares, and they shouldn't. Anyway, your character and control are a bit different in this one, but I actually like the way it controls. You're a bit more floaty, climbing is even smoother, you can grab the bottom of some platforms, and your sword feels as fast and functional as in the first game. Plus you get a cool sword upgrade, which is a huge help. Also, your knockback can still be terrible, but they did change that if you're standing while you get hit, you don't get thrown, which is super nice of them. The levels range from being outdoors, underground with monsters, and even a futuristic and bionic theme. I feel like this helped keep the enemies fresh and interesting. Something we need to mention is the North American port is a bit different than the rest. It is especially criticized because for some reason we got the much harder port. They kept the game easier in Japan, which is really saying something. All enemies do 2 to 3 bars of damage instead of just 1, plus some obstacles like spikes and electricity do 5 bars of damage. This game is so hard that the Japanese version even had a password feature, which of course was removed from our port. And if that wasn't enough, these checkpoints are very few and far between. These levels are much longer. Some sub-levels count from A all the way to E, which would be 5 rooms in a single level. But if you die, you start back on room A. It is ruthless. I mean, you get sent back to do some sections that take minutes, and it can be very hard to get back consistently. The cherry on top is that there are true game overs. If you get 5, back to the title screen for you. Ninja Gaiden 3 is a merciless endurance test. The levels don't just keep getting longer, they're super brutal with death traps and powerful enemies. The bosses do range from easy to kind of hard, but in general they aren't so bad, with the exception of the last 3 bosses again. Before we move on to the bosses, it has to be said this has got to be one of the hardest levels on the NES. I mean, just look at all that goes into getting through these rooms. They're crowded with so many enemies, and if you get caught, they drain so much health. But if you want a chance against the bosses, you really need to keep as much health as possible. This level really does make you work with disappearing floors, robots coming from every direction, projectiles, plenty of pits around with little ground to catch you. It's important for you to fully grasp just how long and difficult this last level is, so I'll rewind from the end all the way to the last checkpoint. I'm sure we can think of some games where they just have those moments where like, oh man, if I can just get past this part, then I'm okay. But this level has like 7 of those moments, man, and it's a serious test of patience and skill to get through this beast. I would say that this is the most challenging set of final bosses so far, just because all of them do so much damage. The first form hovers around while throwing some curving projectiles your way, and then when you hit him, he booms 3 strikes of lightning down onto you. You have to be running full speed and sometimes change direction in order to dodge these. But once you get the hang of it, if you just keep hitting him in the opening and then run to dodge, you should be fine. The second form may look the easiest, but these things, projectiles, do like 5 to 6 blocks of damage to you, which is just atrocious considering they don't refill your life bar before the fight. You could show up with 1/3 of your life bar, but then all it takes is one hit for you to go all the way back to the beginning of this huge level. The third form is really intense. All of a sudden, it's you against a giant robot that shoots a tall projectile along with a bouncing laser or 2 at once. It's just like the previous game's true final bosses, where you need to break its protection in order to hit its weak point. Once you do this, you need to get up close and personal between these 2 crazy lasers going off while you jump and slice like hell. Overall, the NES Ninja Gaiden Trilogy is a monstrous challenge, and conquering these games make you feel like you can conquer the world. The difficulty itself is really the primary reason to play these. The fast control, cool themes, and great music are all things to appreciate, but it's really secondary to the challenge that keeps gamers coming back to these ass-ramming classics. My favorite to play through has got to be the first, and believe it or not, it's closely followed by the third. I really enjoy the flow that game seems to have. Getting all 3 games on a single cartridge would be a fun idea, which is what they brought to the Super Nintendo. If Tecmo could pull off these remakes like Nintendo did with Mario All-Stars, it would definitely be a smash hit, and in my opinion, a must-have with your collection. Today, Ninja Gaiden Trilogy demands a high price, but are these 16-bit ports worth it? Were they done well? Feel free to stick around for the next episode so we can find out. As always, everybody, thank you for watching. I appreciate your likes, comments, and subscriptions, and I also look forward to seeing you for the next review.